Okay, so I wanna start by reading. It's been a while since I read Jung, so I wanna get back to it. And I wanna start with this book. This is a very strange book. It is part 2 of volume 9 of Jung's collected works, and it is about this ion. You see this? The mithraic ion. It's a strange picture that one can contemplate on, I think. Uh, look, look at the face. So it's like a lion in a human body, but it has wings. And I guess it's preaching something. It has something in its hands. Like you see, it has human feet. It says the Mithraic god ion, Roman 2nd, 3rd century. So that's what the book is mainly about. Ion in and of itself means an age, like an eternity, something that is outside of time and space. So we can sort of think of ion like this. But anyway, it's supposed to be a crazy book. Researchers into the phenomenology of the self, right? So let's see. Anyway, all this boring stuff. But look at the table of contents. It is pretty interesting. So it talks about the ego, the shadow, the syzygy, right? Anima and animus, the self, Christ, a symbol of the self. So the crazy thing about this book is that Jung didn't have all of this planned out when he was writing it. I think he wanted to write about ego, and then at some point he realized that Christ is a symbol of the self, and so on. The sign of the fishes, the prophecies of Nostradamus, historical significance of the fish, the ambivalence of the fish symbol, the fish in alchemy. So there is all sorts of alchemical stuff going on here that is quite difficult to understand, I think. The alchemical interpretation of the fish, background to the psychology of Christian alchemical symbolism, Gnostic symbols of the self, the structure and dynamics of the self. What I heard is that the last 2/3 of the book is really deep and profound. The last 1/3 of it. And the first 2/3 are quite difficult to understand, I think, because they use a lot of symbolism from alchemy. They use a lot of symbolism from Gnosticism, alchemy, from astrology, so they're a bit difficult to understand. So I'm deciding if we should start from the beginning or we should just delve right into it. 222. The structure and dynamics of the self. But interesting though, let's go to page 222 because why not? Let's at least read the foreword. What the hell is going on in the foreword? Is it big? Not that big. The theme of this work is the idea of aeon. My investigation seeks, with the help of Christian, Gnostic, and alchemical symbols of the self, to throw light on the change of psychic situation within the Christian aeon. Christian tradition from the outset is not only saturated with Persian and Jewish ideas about the beginning and end of time, but is filled with intimations of a kind of enantiodromian reversal of dominance, but is filled with the intimations of a kind of enantiodromian reversal of dominance. I mean by this the dilemma of Christ and Antichrist. Probably most of the historical speculations about time and the division of time were influenced as the apocalypse shows, by astrological ideas. Look what this is saying. Probably most of the historical speculations about time and the division of time were influenced by astrological ideas. Right? Like, if you look at the way we think of time, right? We have years, and within a year we have 12 months, right? That comes from astrology, because in astrology we have 12 signs. We have 12 signs in astrology, so is that why we think of a year as consisting of 12 months? Right? I think that's what Jung is trying to say, that a lot of how we think about time is what astrology actually tells us. So astrology isn't just a science about planets. It actually has nothing to do with the planets. Astrology, deep down, is a set of ideas about what time is and the properties of time, right? It turns out time has properties. It is therefore only natural that my reflections should gravitate mainly round the symbol of the fishes, for the Pisces ion. Is that how you read this? Pisces ion is the synchronistic concomitant of 2000 years of Christian development. In this time period, not only was the figure of the Anthropos, the Son of Man, progressively amplified symbolically and thus assimilated psychologically, but it is brought with the changes in man's attitude that had already been anticipated by the expectation of the Antichrist in the ancient texts. Because these texts relegate the appearance of Antichrist to the end of time, we are justified in speaking of a Christian ion, which it was presupposed would find its end with the second coming. It seems as if this expectation coincides with the astrological conception of the Platonic months of the fishes. Okay. The immediate occasion for my proposing to discuss these historical questions is the fact that the archetypal image of wholeness, which appears so frequently in the products of the unconscious, has its forerunners in history. These were identified very early in the figure of Christ, as I've shown in my book Psychology and Alchemy. I've been requested so often by my readers to discuss the relations between the traditional Christ figure and the natural symbols of wholeness, or the self, that I finally decided to take this task in hand. Considering the unusual difficulties of such an undertaking, my decision did not come easily to me, for in order to surmount all the obstacles and possibilities of error, a knowledge and caution would be needed, which unfortunately vouchsafed me only in limited degree. I am moderately certain of my observations on the empirical material, but I am fully aware of the risk I am taking in drawing the testimonies of history to the scope of my reflections. I think I also know my responsibility I am taking upon myself when, as though continuing the historical process of assimilation, I add to the many symbolical amplifications of the Christ figure yet another, the psychological one, or even, so it may seem, reduce the Christian symbol to a psychological image of wholeness. My reader should never forget, however, that I am not making a confession of faith or writing a tendentious tract, but I'm simply considering how certain things could be understood from the standpoint of a modern consciousness, things which I deem it valuable to understand, and which are obviously in danger of being swallowed up in the abyss of incomprehension and oblivion. Things, finally, whose understanding would do so much to remedy our philosophical disorientation by shedding light on the psychic background and the secret chambers of the soul. The answers of this book was built up gradually in the course of many years in countless conversations with people of all ages and all walks of life, with people who, in the confusion and uprootedness of our society, were likely to lose all contact with the meaning of European culture and to fall into the state of suggestibility, which is the occasion and cause of the utopian mass psychosis of our time. Right? Look at this. With people who, in the confusion and uprootedness of our society, were likely to lose all contact with the meaning of European culture and to fall into the state of suggestibility, which is the occasion and cause of the utopian mass cycles of our time. Right? What Jung is saying here is that we actually don't really understand a huge part of our culture, especially when it comes to religion, because if you look at, for example, the Christ figure, usually when you talk to religious people and you talk to them about religion, they're always debating about the historical narrative. Did Christ really exist? Or is it a myth? And what Jung, I think, at some point is saying is, that's asking the wrong question. It doesn't matter if the historical thing took place. The way he looks at religion is the way you would look at dreams. How do you look at dreams? If you have a dream, and let's say in your dreams crazy things are happening, a horse is flying, right? Like you go into the water and suddenly you're inside a castle and suddenly there's a fire, right? Like just crazy things are happening. You don't look at your dreams from the standpoint of the physical world. You don't say, oh, horses cannot fly, therefore the dream is stupid, and therefore I should reject it. That's not what you say. You don't look at the dream world through the lens of the physics of this physical world. The dream world has its own physics. It has its own language. It has its own way of speaking. And just because you cannot make sense of dreams through the physics of our world doesn't mean that the dreams in and of themselves are meaningless. Just like that, we look at religion, and just because certain religious stories do not make sense from the standpoint of physics, right, like Noah separating the water, you might look at that and say, what the hell? But you should look at them the way you look at dreams, right? What does it mean? And at some point, whether something happened or not is not so important. What is more important is, what does it mean? What does it mean? Noah separating water, what does it mean? Abraham being willing to sacrifice, what does it mean? And I think a question Jung is trying to answer in this book is, what does the figure of Christ really mean? And I think he's trying to say that it is a symbol for the wholeness of the self. I don't understand that, to be honest, which is why I'm reading this book. So that would be an interesting thing to understand. How the Christ figure is a symbol of the self. In what way, right? Like that would be an interesting sort of look. Anyway, I write as a physician with a physician's sense of responsibility, not as a proselyte. Nor do I write as a scholar. Okay, cool. Otherwise, I would wisely barricade myself behind the safe walls of my specialism, and not on account of my inadequate knowledge of history expose myself to critical attack and damage my scientific reputation. So far as my capacities allow, restricted as they are by old age and illness, I have made every effort to document my material as reliably as possible and to assist the verifications of my conclusions by citing the resources. You see, like it was written in 1950, so like he was like 70 something, I think, when he wrote this. 70 or 80, I don't know. Very old. One of his later books. And it is a fundamentally new way of looking at things, I think, this book. It's a difficult book to understand, but I think Jung is trying to explain certain things to us that he kept hidden for a long time. For a while, when he was writing books, he always wanted to talk to his audience and meet them where the audience is. With this book, I think he's just writing down what he thinks, and whether you can catch up with him or not is up to you. He's running, and he expects you to run with him. And if you cannot run with him, then you'll fall behind. Can we understand this book? I don't know. We have to see. These things come to pass, as they say, that Jesus might be made the first sacrifice in the discrimination of composite natures. You see, this is what I mean. Like, what the hell does this mean? These things come to pass, they say, that Jesus might be made the first sacrifice in the discrimination of composite natures. Interesting. I guess let's start from the ego and then we'll continue further on. Let's see. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which require the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is a self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a supraordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, so no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. With this definition, we have described and delimited the scope of the subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects, those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown of the outer world, the second is the unknown of the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. Right? Like, deep inside us, not everything is known, right? Deep inside us, there's a huge part of our psyche is actually unknown. We don't know it. And that's what is the unconscious. The ego, as a specific content of consciousness, is not a simple or elementary factor, but a complex one which as such cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on two seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already on a psychic nature and are associated with the ego, and are therefore conscious. What? The somatic basis inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already of a psychic nature and associated with the ego, and are therefore conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross this threshold of consciousness. A considerable portion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is, subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely physiological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, that is, of becoming perceptions, but there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature, unless, of course, one favors the philosophical view that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and it interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague and nebulous. I have therefore suggested that the term psychic be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex or instinctual processes. Here I must refer the reader to my paper on the nature of the psyche, where I have discussed this definition of the psychic in some great length. Okay, so he defines something psychic as somewhat limited by, okay, we don't really care. What's next? The somatic basis of the ego consists then of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. First, temporarily, subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, memory. Second, unconscious concepts that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Look what he's saying. He's saying that certain things actually cannot become conscious at all, right? Like that's kind of crazy. Like deep in your unconscious, I guess at the very depth of it, there are certain things that can never be made conscious. That's interesting. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from facts underlying Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet erupted into consciousness or which never will. Right? Like they're like in your unconscious. It's really fascinating. Like it turns out that there are certain actors behind the scenes who are doing their work diligently, but about whose existence you will never know. And you will never know. You might never know and become conscious of certain things that are happening in your unconscious. Because your unconscious is filled with billions of sub-personalities, right? Like entities which have their own goals, dreams, hopes, and they know what they're doing. Like a human, you can think of them like that, but they will never be conscious, right? So it's an interesting thought to think about. Why does something go from the unconscious to the consciousness? Who decides? Right? Like, how does this transition work? When I said that the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as the whole. The ego is only the latter point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, right? Look, although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. Right? Like he's saying, the roots of your ego may be deeply hidden in the unconscious. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment. Look, I'm tired of this word somatic. What the hell is somatic? Let's see. Relating to the body, especially as distinct from the mind. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment. And once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and the inner. As you interact with the outer world, right, you develop your ego, okay. Despite the unlimited extent of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could theoretically at least be described completely, but this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All these features, which are known or unconscious to the subject, would be missing. A total picture would have to include this, but a total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible, because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. This unconscious portion, as experience is abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with their help, right? Certain qualities that you have that are just unconscious. And that's true. I think I'm deeply unconscious about a lot of the qualities that I have. And so to say that I'm fully aware of my personality or my ego would be a mistake. Oftentimes when I interact with other people, then I realize that, oh, I actually am a very disagreeable person. I actually wouldn't want to hang out with myself, right? Like certain things you discover only when you contact with the external world. And so the roots of your ego are deeply hidden in the unconscious, and certain parts of your personality are unconscious also. And you have to keep that in mind. And just because a certain part of your personality is unconscious doesn't mean that it's unimportant, right? That might actually be the important part. Clearly then, the personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego. Correct, I agree. Personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is with the conscious personality, but it forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the facts of the unconscious, but for such a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, it should be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not, for instance, in adjusting the question of responsibility. I have suggested calling the total personality, which through present cannot be fully unknown, the self. The self is like the total personality. So self is like your total personality. Part of it you're conscious of, the other parts of it are deeply hidden in the unconscious and you're not conscious of them. But together they form yourself. The ego is by definition subordinate to the self and is related to it like part of the whole, right? Your ego is part of yourself, the conscious part of it, you can say. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. By this, I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, or rather the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with the necessity in the outside world, so it also finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence which free will can do very little to alter. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but it sometimes actually assimilates by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. Right? What he's saying is, you have yourself, and your ego is only part of it. And just like we humans are part of the natural world. And sometimes things happen in the natural world for reasons that I don't understand that limit my freedom. And so yourself is like this bigger picture that acts on the ego, and sometimes your ego cannot do anything against it. Right? It's a paternal figure, so to speak. It acts on the ego, but not the other way around. It is, in the nature of the case, impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take into account the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are in themselves everywhere the same, they are indefinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains the identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alterations of this kind need not always be pathological. They can also be developmental and hence fall within the scope of the normal. Since it is the point of reference for the field of consciousness, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation so far as these are achieved by the will. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. That's a huge mistake, right? If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Keres and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psychic outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. Important, right? It is questionable whether ego is the center of the personality. Да, тут сидим.